All right, in the previous video, we kind of set up the problem, right? That's, that was enough, just kind of have you go through or at least watch my, or infer or get my thinking on how we're going to do this. So I'm just giving us some room here. All right, so we're going to use pandas, all right? We're going to use SciPy, we're going to use NumPy, and we're also going to bring in another, import another package, which is date time. So let's put our import numpy as np. And then we want to import date time, because we want to be able to be able to come up with a new variable called weeks or week, right? Because when we look at the invoice purchase file, right, and we'll bring this up in a second, we're going to see that we've got a few dates, all right? So one of those dates we want to do something with, all right? So let's read in our sales file. We'll call that df pd.read underscore csv, right? You're getting really good at this. Sales final 6/30/2021 .csv. All right, I'm gonna keep on. I know I don't have to, but I'm gonna keep doing it. Sales date equals PD to date time, and we want that to be DF and sales date. Okay, and then we want to read in our invoice. I'm going to call that DFINV, and that equals PD.read underscore CSV. And we're going to read in, and I want to make sure I get the name correct, invoice purchases. Okay, beautiful. Invoice purchases 6/30/2021 .csv. Okay, and I'm going to read that in, and so I'm going to run all of these. Read that in, and read this in. All right, because I want to see after we read these all in, I want to take a look at the date variables that we have. Okay, now I can also go back to my invoice purchases data table and see that I've got a few dates. I've got invoice date, I've got PO date, I've got the pay date, right? So I've got 3 different dates. Well, which date should we use? Well, the purchase order date probably precedes by a number of days or weeks when I actually receive it, right? The invoice date may happen days after I get the goods, right? And then pay date may happen 30, 40, 60 days after that, right? In the sales file, right, in my sales file, I don't have anything else. I guess if we wanted to, we could look at purchases because we have a receiving date. But on the receiving date, I'm not going to sell that stuff. So if I think about the invoice date, that may be a better representation of when I'm actually going to sell this stuff. So we may end up using the invoice date. So here we go. Let's look at our data frame. All right, we got invoice date, PO date, and where's my pay date. So we've got 3 dates in there. I think I'm going to try and use invoice date to see if there's an association. So just to put some language around all of this, we have 3 dates. invoice purchase file. There's also a fourth date we should consider, and that was that receiving date. The 3 dates in the invoice purchase file are the PO date, the invoice date, and the payment date. If we are trying to get the relationship between freight costs and sales, the PO date may be too early. It is likely that the PO date precedes the date we actually receive the goods. There's a similar issue with payment date. Payment date may be significantly after we receive the goods. So of the 3 dates in the invoice purchases file, the invoice date is likely the best approximation of when we actually have the inventory available to sell. A more precise date might be the receiving date, but we don't have the receiving date in the invoice purchases file, but that date does exist, as I showed you, in the purchases file, right? Not invoice purchases, but purchases. So we're gonna go with the invoice date. So as a result, if I look at my data frame and let's see, what's dfinv dot I remember what that code was, just to get the different variables and what they are. So I wanted to find out what my variables are in here. I'm going to write in dfinv, and I want the information, what each variable is. So we're going to run that. And what we've got here is we've got our variables. So vendor number comes in as an integer, and PO number comes in as an integer, and quantity comes as an integer, and then dollars and freight come as a float. Everything else is an object or a string. So I need to make our invoice date. We have to do the same change for invoice date, but we're going to do it for the in the invoice purchases file. So we're going to say df invoice purchases. We want the invoice date, and we want that PD to date time dfinv, and we want invoice date. All right, we're that, right? And then if I go back and just rerun this the info, I now have changed invoice date to a date time. Okay. All right. So the goal is to see whether or not the invoice date is going to be associated with sales. So for this example, I'm going to rely on the invoice date. And not, I'm just going to rely on the invoice date. The next step is we've got to bring we got to go through and make sure that we get all of the sales by, when we talked about doing it by week. So that's going to be the next step in this process. So the next step is to find the week number. For each date in both files. All right. And in our next video, we're going to introduce that code on how to do that.